to think of it as outside, inside, because it concerns a mystical temple and a physical temple in history. A mystical temple outside of time and a mystical coming in outside of time. But it also refers to temples that are in time with going out and coming in. It also refers to temples built and temples lost. But we are celebrating a temple that cannot be destroyed, that is not lost, that is eternal. This is a wonderful day for me because today follows between two gospels that are wonderfully placed together. The wisdom of the church is, first of all, that it would create this feast. That's wisdom. And I have to show that. But the accidental wisdom is that we would have 2 Sundays, and this feast would land on a Sunday. And last Sunday, we spoke about the Good Samaritan. And I mentioned a question, but an astute listener would say, but there are 2 questions. That's right. The answer was go and do likewise. But the other question was with regards to who took care of the man who'd fallen among thieves and robbers, who was beaten and bloodied. When the priest failed him and the Levite failed him, it was the Samaritan who comes and tends to his wounds. It's the Samaritan who dips into his pocket, his purse, and puts out the money, shows the benevolence. And the Lord's answer to that is, the Lord's question rather to the lawyer is, which one of the 3 is actually doing the commands? And the lawyer, of course, answers rightly the second time. This is another day to be a good lawyer. And he says, of course, it's the last one, the Samaritan. And then comes the answer. Then go and do likewise to him. Now, in our society, we know that we have people who are inside and outsiders. In our society, it's often poverty and the absence of goods that mark outsiders. Insiders tend to have cash. They tend to have wealth. And today's gospel is a strong warning to those of us who are tending to a mortgage or tending to a car. Maybe you've paid it off. For those of us who drive good cars and have good things, today's gospel is a strong, frankly, it's a cold shower. It's a cold dip in the pond, because the Lord reminds us that at any moment our life can be required of us, and that everything that we've built up, these new barns that we've brought up and filled with grain, could be for nothing. We don't know our future. And rather, in the gospel, he mentions birds, crows. They don't worry about tomorrow. It's interesting, in the translation where it says crows, it's very prescient, because now we know that crows are quite intelligent and that they work very hard. But even despite their intelligence and their ability to work in group and their ability to even mimic, and sometimes it appears to even speak, and they live in groups called, I believe, murders of crows. Isn't that a word for you? Nonetheless, these smart birds, they have to work hard. They work from the moment the first light of dawn comes up until the last light of sunset. They're working hard. They have to eat their body weight every day to stay alive. So if someone says to you, you're eating like a bird, they might be telling you to go on a diet, because birds eat a tremendous amount in ratio to who and what they are. And so in the gospel, when it says, be like the crows, it's actually quite a compliment. It means you're going to work really hard, but I'd like to say it's a compliment in the gospel to your intelligence and your God-given gifts. And so we have to be spiritually dutiful about the things that we own and what we're going to do with them. That's a personal journey for all of us that we're going to have to face. I don't believe there are any monastics here in this service this morning, and so we have to work out our life as people in the world, as good, righteous Christians living and working out our salvation in the world as it's given to us. The church gives us this day to remind us that the spiritual triumphs over the material. The spiritual has precedence over all things physical. The church, in her wisdom and in her spiritual power, erects a feast that is completely apocryphal. We do not have evidence that the Virgin Mary entered the temple. In fact, It's difficult to countenance because the temple, the actual temple itself, could only be entered into and touched actually by a Levite. It's an exclusive property. I'm speaking of the temple in Jerusalem. This is the temple of Solomon and the restored temple under Herod. Around it is a courtyard, a rather large one. The remnants, I believe today, is what we see as the Temple Mount, is that courtyard. Certain worshipers could enter that courtyard. And then around that is a set of porticos, passageways, and around that another area into which you can go. So to come into the temple is actually a rather wide notion. You could literally enter into that ground in one of those places and be saying, I'm in the temple, and you'd be right. It depends on your rank and who you are. The church goes so far as to accelerate the Holy Theotokos and Virgin Mary. They accelerate her in the icons, as you can see right before you here, that she's actually inside the temple being greeted by the high priest, who would be receiving incense, gifts of incense in that part of the temple. She's before the Holy of Holy. And so that gives us a little time for history. These temples that I'm speaking of, Solomon's and Herod's, these are the temples in Jerusalem. But did you know there's another temple? Yes, the Samaritans. Why are the Samaritans reviled? They're outsiders. The Samaritan in the gospel from last week is actually an outsider. His people actually believe that the holiest place is not Mount Moriah next to Jerusalem. They believe it's another place. It's Merah or Gerizim. And on that place, they believe that is where God spoke to the patriarchs of old. They erected a temple there. And with this, a competition with Jerusalem began in history that went on and on and on. And over time, the Samaritans would be diminished. They still exist today. There's about 1,000 left today in Israel. Through intermarriage and some other vicissitudes, their numbers have declined, but they still are there, and they still hold to the belief in the other mount, the other temple. And so that's why it's important to note when Jesus says about the Samaritan, he's speaking of an insider, but also an outsider. He's speaking about a fellow Jew who is completely in the covenant, completely a descendant of Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, completely so. And yet an outsider in terms of Judah, an outsider in terms of Jerusalem of old. And the beauty of our feast today is the Virgin Mary, who is a daughter of the house of Judah, who is of that lineage, is able to embrace all of these versions of the temple, Solomon's, Herod's, and the Samaritan, bringing them all together in a triumph of the mystical over the physical. Why is this the case? Because ultimately, iconographically, when you say Jesus and the Samaritan, you're saying the same thing. In our icons, Jesus is the Good Samaritan. Some sermons would try to make Jesus into a political activist, something of a proto-woke figure who sees the downtrodden and the outcast, but rather, as I mentioned to you, the Samaritans are actually insiders. They're separated insiders. They're like us. We are insiders right now, but many of us are still separated, well, frankly, by sins, by weaknesses, things that we have yet to be able to overcome. God have mercy on us. We're outsiders, yet we're insiders. And so the gospel last week is, who is doing this right thing? It is the third one, the Samaritan, because Jesus Christ is the Good Samaritan, and we follow him. And now this week, we have the spiritual luxury to think about the Virgin Mary, who is the new Ark of the Covenant, who is coming into the temple, who is mystically portrayed as before the Holy of Holies. And why is this important? Because the Holy of Holies contains the actual Ark of the old time, before there were temples, when the Ark was in a tent, when the Ark was moved around in an elaborate mid-ritual. And we can see this in the book of Numbers, the detail with which the Jewish community, the Hebrew community, took care of the Ark took care of managing it, with which the tribe of Levi, dedicated only to that purpose, and having no land of their own, living on the donations of the other tribes, took care of this sacred object and kept it reserved and protected. We know its history because it was not always protected. It was in fact conquered and stolen by Philistines and recovered. It has a history that goes up and it goes down. And finally, with the building of the physical temples, the Ark of the Covenant is situated there. What is on top of the Ark of the Covenant? Because that's what matters. Usually the depiction is two angels facing one another and an open space above them. Inside the ark, by tradition, are the tablets of the law, the rod of Aaron, and particles of the manna from Sinai. But most importantly, above those angels is referred to as the mercy seat. It is that place where God's presence actually inhabits, dwells, and situates. It's that place that is sprinkled with the blood of sacrifice once a year by the high priest when he enters into it once a year, on hands and knees, with vestments with bells so they would know where he's at because there's no speaking, with a rope on his ankles so that in case he's struck, he can be pulled out and no one has to violate the sacred area. All of this is coming into a great holy concatenation of what the temple is. And mystically, our church, it's a beautiful thing. We place the Holy Virgin Mary right before the Holy of Holies to announce to us the coming of the incarnation of Jesus Christ, the prefiguring of the Holy of Holies being made flesh. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen the glory of the Lord. And this is the meaning of today. And so I would ask you to please join me in prayer and be grateful that we get to be part of an iconic, mysterious church, that we get to be part of a church that is so secure in its apostolic foundation that it would dare, in a spiritual form of dare, it would be broad and it would take upon itself the duty of erecting a feast that is completely mystical. Why? Because everything that we do is predicated on the body of Jesus Christ, born in a manger, erected on a cross at Calvary, resurrected on the third day, ascended to the right hand of the Father. Our faith is predicated on the body and the blood of so many martyrs, real bodies, real blood. And yet today we celebrate mystical body, mystical blood, and the mystical coming of our Lord and Savior in the flesh. God have mercy on us. The blessings of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love towards mankind, always, now, and ever, and unto the